morning. Today I will be reading from Mark 6, verses 1 through 6. Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household." And he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief and went about among the villages teaching.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you here this morning and to welcome you. If you're visiting with us, we're very glad that you're here, and to welcome those of you who are on Zoom with us this morning as well. In his Gospel, Mark has been presenting us with a picture of Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God. This was how Mark announced his work in the very first verse, in chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark is writing for us the good news about this person who is called Jesus. But not everyone will be receptive to this good news. The things that Jesus is doing and the things that he is saying are producing different reactions and responses in the hearts of the people, just like the seed that falls onto the different types of soil that Jesus spoke of in the parable that we looked at last week. From the end of chapter 4 and into the beginning of chapter 6, Mark records a series of miracles and incidents which demonstrate for us the different reactions that people had to Jesus, the different types of heart that either receive or reject what they witness. The miracles that Mark records in this section show Jesus' power over nature, his power over demons, his power over disease, and even his power over death itself. Although Jesus exercised power over these different realms, Mark also shows us that Jesus had no power over people's fear and unbelief. At the end of the day, when Jesus had been teaching the crowds in parables, he proposed to his disciples that they should cross to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus had been in the town of Capernaum on the northern shore of the sea, and they are now about to cross to the southeastern shore, to the region known as the Decapolis, or the 10 cities, which was a predominantly Gentile area. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41 tells of this voyage. In the evening, Jesus left the crowd and he was taken into the boat by the disciples, just as he was, Mark says. So he didn't go home to clean up or to change, but he went as he was. The Sea of Galilee was often calm, but was susceptible to sudden, violent storms. And one occurred as Jesus and his disciples made this voyage. Chapter 4, verse 37 says, "And a great storm of wind arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already filling." The waves have risen up and they're coming over and they're filling up the boat, and the boat is in danger of sinking. But Jesus is untroubled by what is happening. He is in the stern of the boat, fast asleep on a cushion. The disciples, some of whom were experienced fishermen and so familiar with storms on the sea, went to Jesus to wake him up, saying, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" How could Jesus remain asleep through such a life-threatening storm? The disciples interpret his behavior as a lack of concern for their safety. "Don't you care that we are perishing?" When awoken by the disciples, we're told that Jesus rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And at Jesus' command, The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. All that was needed was for Jesus to speak, and peace and calm was restored to the sea. And Jesus then spoke to his disciples, and he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" The disciples' panicked reaction to the storm suggested their lack of faith. Fear, that sense of impending doom, and faith, that expression of trust in something greater than ourselves, are mutually exclusive reactions to any situation that we might face. Fear will stifle faith, whereas faith will drive away fear. And the disciples were afraid that they were about to perish whilst Jesus remained asleep. And it didn't occur to them that the presence of Jesus there in the boat, the one who they had seen perform miracles before, would actually keep them safe. They did not think that rather than being a sign of indifference, Jesus asleep in the boat was a sign of confidence that no harm was about to befall them. No need to panic, because everything is under control when Jesus is present. And although the disciples have spent much time with Jesus, they still do not really know him. They don't really understand him. In verse 41 we read, "And they were filled with awe and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even wind and sea obey him?'" They've seen Jesus do other miracles, but never anything like this before. Who could possibly command the elements, the uncontrollable forces of nature? And this is something that causes them to wonder about the identity of Jesus. Who then is this, that even wind and sea obey him? Well, when Jesus and his disciples reached the other side of the sea, the country of the Gerasenes, they were met by a man who was possessed by an unclean spirit. And we've seen in this series Jesus cast out demons before. This seems to be a particularly severe and disturbing case. This man lives amongst the tombs, and he displays extraordinary strength, breaking the chains and fetters that are used to restrain him. And night and day he constantly cries out, and he inflicts bruises upon himself with stones. When the man saw Jesus, though, he ran and worshipped him, crying out, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." In chapter 5 and verse 7. The man knew who Jesus was and begged that Jesus should not torment him. We're told that Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. The unclean spirits in control of this man were fearful of what Jesus might do to them because they recognized the power of Jesus. And Jesus then asked the man, "What is your name?" And the spirits in possession of this man replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And so the sad condition of this man becomes apparent. He is possessed by many demons. And the demons beg that Jesus should send them into a herd of swine feeding there on the nearby hillside. Jesus agreed to their request, and the spirits entered the swine, which we're told numbered around 2,000. The swine then rushed down the hillside into the sea, and they were drowned. It's a dramatic and a disturbing story. What Jesus had done, though, was quickly reported to the people of that region by the herdsmen who were looking after those pigs. When the people came to see what had happened, they saw this man who had been possessed by these many demons sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Well, why were they afraid? This man who they had been unable to control, who was constantly crying out and self-harming, is now sitting there quietly. He's clothed, he's in his right mind. The man has been transformed. He's no longer troubled by his demons. But not only were these people afraid, Mark tells us they began to beg Jesus to depart from their neighborhood. They didn't want Jesus to be there. At least when the man was demon-possessed, they knew where they stood with him. They could adapt themselves to his presence. They could live their lives around this inconvenience. But this man, Jesus, has just come in and he's caused an even greater disturbance. And if Jesus can transform this demon-possessed man, then what can he do to us? And they cannot comprehend this. And so they want Jesus to go away. As for the man himself, he begged to be allowed to go with Jesus. He knew what Jesus had done for him, and now he wanted to become a follower of Jesus too. But Jesus would not allow him to go with him. Instead, he told him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you." And the man did, just as Jesus had asked, sharing this good news amongst the people of the Decapolis, and we're told that all men marveled. This is another story demonstrating the power of Jesus, this time power over the demons. And again in this we see the reaction of fear and faith. The demons know who Jesus is, and they are afraid of what he might do to them. And it's a justified fear. They were right to be afraid, because Jesus is in control. In contrast, the local people do not know who Jesus is, and they cannot understand his power. They fear what they cannot understand, and so they just want Jesus to leave, to go away. And Jesus will not stay where he's not wanted, and so he leaves. But the man who had been possessed by the unclean spirits knew Jesus had changed his life, and he was willing to obey Jesus by remaining there and telling others what the Lord had done for him, and so demonstrating his faith. And so Jesus and his disciples got back in the boat and they left. When Jesus arrived back on the other side of the sea, he was met by a great crowd of people. In chapter 5, verse 21 here. A ruler of the local synagogue named Jairus came and fell at the feet of Jesus and begged him, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hand on her so that she may be made well and live." Jairus expressed his faith in Jesus' ability to restore to health his daughter, who we learn later is 12 years old, who is close to death. He was given hope when Jesus agreed to go with him to his home. However, before Jesus can get there, his journey will be interrupted by someone else who is in need, an interruption which will test the faith of Jairus. Jesus is being followed here by a great crowd of people, and amongst that crowd is a woman who has been ill for 12 years with a flow of blood. The doctors she has consulted have not been able to help her. She's spent all of her money on treatment, and her condition has only got worse rather than better. But she's heard about Jesus, and now hidden there amongst the crowd, she has come up behind Jesus and she has touched his garment, for she had convinced herself, "If I touch even his garments, I shall be made well." This was her faith, a simple belief that all she needed to do was to touch Jesus' garment. She wouldn't need to speak to him, she wouldn't need to look him in the eye, just touch him and she will be made well. And indeed, her faith was rewarded. For when she touched Jesus, we are told that immediately the hemorrhage ceased, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. It happened immediately she touched Jesus, and she could sense it within herself that she had been made well. But then suddenly Jesus turned around to the crowd and he asked, "Who touched my garments?" Because he knew that power had gone forth from him. He could sense that something had happened here. Well, not understanding what had happened, the disciples tried to dismiss the question and suggested that, well, Jesus is just being a bit oversensitive. There's a great crowd pressing around you and you ask, who touched me? That's like a rugby player in the scrum saying, who touched me? But Jesus is still looking into that crowd. And knowing what had been done to her, the woman now came forward, we're told, in fear and trembling. And she fell before Jesus and she told him her whole story. Why was she afraid? She'd just been healed by Jesus. But she had tried to receive healing secretly, without any kind of public attention. And now her actions have been exposed, and she is trembling with fear. But Jesus is not out to reprimand her or to publicly embarrass her. Instead, he publicly commends her for her faith. He addresses her affectionately as daughter. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. And again, we see here the presence of fear and faith. It was faith that brought the woman to Jesus in the first place. But after knowing that she had been healed, there was a reaction of fear when she realized that her deed could not be hidden. But fear then gives way to assurance when Jesus commends her act of faith. Well, we can only imagine what must have been going through the mind of Jairus at this point and this delay in their journey to his home. And as Jesus is still speaking, a messenger arrives with the dreadful news, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? As long as the girl was alive, Jairus had faith that Jesus would be able to lay his hands on her and she would be made well and she would not die. But now she is dead, so why waste any more of Jesus' time? Surely it is too late. But Jesus simply said to Jairus, do not fear, only believe. Fear is not the right response to this news, but rather faith is. And these words give Jairus the hope that something can be done here. When they arrived at the house, there were people there who were weeping and wailing. And Jesus asked them, why do you make a tumult and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And the people laughed at Jesus because they knew she was dead. So Jesus put those people outside and he took with him the girl's mother, the father, and his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and they went into the place where the girl was lying. He took her by the hand, and Mark records the Aramaic words that Jesus spoke, Talitha Kumai, which Mark explains means, little girl, I say to you, arise. The tenderness and compassion of Jesus is evident in his act of taking her by the hand and speaking gently to her. Come on, little girl, it's time to get up. And in response, the girl immediately got up and walked. And we're told they were immediately overcome with amazement. The girl was dead, and now she is up and she's walking around, she's in good health. And Jesus tells them to give her something to eat, because being dead is hungry work. Jesus then strictly charged them that no one should know this. When news of the girl's death came through, Jesus had told Jairus, do not fear, only believe. So once again, faith overcomes fear. We've seen here Jesus' power over nature, his power over the demons, his power over disease, and his power over death. And in these instances, Jesus challenged fear and encouraged faith. But now we come to an incident in chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, where Jesus' power is curtailed. Mark tells us that Jesus left the area where he had been doing these things, which is around the Sea of Galilee, and he came to his own country. Jesus' own country was Nazareth and the surrounding area, as Mark told us in chapter 1, verse 9, that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee. On the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue and he began to teach. And those who heard him were astonished. Where did this man get all this? What is the wisdom given him? What mighty works are wrought by his hand? But then their astonishment quickly turned to contempt when they realized who Jesus was. Is not this the carpenter, son of Mary, brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? We know this man. He's the local carpenter. Remember, we called on him last year to come and fix our roof when it was leaking, and he put up a new gate for us. We know his mother. This is Mary's boy, and his brothers and sisters still live around here. Why is he talking like this? What is this we're hearing about these great works he's supposed to have done? No one from Nazareth ever does anything like this. And Mark says they took offence at him. Their prejudice against him caused them to stumble. And all they could see was this local boy, someone they'd known all their lives, and now he thinks he's some kind of prophet, or perhaps even the Messiah. And Jesus responded by saying, a prophet is not without honour except in his own country, and among his own kin, and in his own house. It is most difficult to find acceptance amongst your own people, amongst those who think that they know you, but who don't really know you at all. And this rejection by his own meant that Jesus could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands upon a few sick people and healed them. No great miracles were done in his own country, no calming of the storms, no casting out of demons, no raising of the dead, just a few healings. Jesus is not going to show his power amongst those who take offence at him. And Mark says he marvelled because of their unbelief. People marvelled at Jesus' mighty works, whilst Jesus marvelled at people's unbelief. Fear is one thing. Fear can be overcome with faith. But unbelief, well, that's something else. Unbelief is that deliberate hard-heartedness, that unwillingness to believe no matter what, that stubborn refusal to face up to the truth. And unbelief doesn't deserve mighty works. Unbelief will not be convinced even by such things. We could have spent a week here on each of the incidents that we've looked at today. They're all worthy of a separate sermon each. But I wanted us to see the link between these incidents and that theme of fear and faith and unbelief that runs through there. The fear of the disciples in the storm on the sea, the fear of the demons at the thought of where Jesus might send them, the fear of the local people over what Jesus had done and who would now prefer it if Jesus just left them alone, the fear of the woman who touched Jesus secretly when her actions were made known, the fear of Jairus when news came that his daughter had died, and the unbelief of Jesus' own people, which prevented them from seeing who Jesus really was. Jesus challenges these fears and this unbelief. To the disciples, he says, why are you afraid? Have you no faith? And he calms the storm. To the demon-possessed man, he says, go home and tell your friends how much the Lord has done for you. And he went off and proclaimed these things. To the woman, he said, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. To Jairus, when he was told that his daughter had just died, Jesus said, do not fear, only believe. And Jesus went and raised that girl back to life. Faith triumphed over fear in all these stories. But then in his own country, amongst his own people, Jesus was not met by fear or by faith, but by unbelief. And in the face of unbelief, even Jesus could do nothing. So where do we see ourselves in these stories? Who do we most closely identify ourselves with? We all have fears. Even when we have faith, we still have fears. But that faith must grow and develop as we place ourselves in the caring hands of Jesus, trusting him to help us to overcome our fears, to face up to those daily challenges with faith and with confidence. And whilst unbelief will prevent us from seeing who Jesus really is, it is faith overcoming fear which will enable us to place our trust in Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. So do not fear, only believe.